Victor Wembanyama just dropped 41 points and 24 rebounds in his first Western Conference Finals game at 22 years old, and somehow that might not even be the most insane thing he's done this postseason. Welcome to Hoops Pill. If you're new here, subscribe, drop a like, and don't go anywhere because this one is worth every second. Here's what makes this whole thing so hard to wrap your head around. Before the 2026 playoffs even started, Victor was already considered one of the most valuable players in basketball. First team All-NBA at 22, arguably the best defender on the planet, an offensive game that at his age had no real comparison. That was supposed to be the ceiling of where he was right now. Instead, it turned out to be the floor, because once the playoffs began, something shifted, and the version of Wembanyama the rest of the NBA was about to see wasn't just better, it was operating on a level that genuinely made people question whether they'd ever seen anything like it before. His playoff debut against Portland set the tone immediately. 35 points on over 60% shooting in Game 1 of his first ever postseason. Historically, only 4 players had ever recorded at least 35 points on that kind of efficiency in a playoff debut. Chris Paul, Derrick Rose, some guy named Gary, and now Victor Wembanyama. That's not a list you stumble onto. That's a list that takes a lifetime to reach. He walked into the biggest stage of his professional life and played like he'd been there 100 times before. And the scariest part wasn't even the performance itself, it was how casual it looked, like he was barely scratching the surface of what he was capable of. Then came the second round and Minnesota in Game 3. Road environment, hostile crowd, everything loud and uncomfortable, the exact type of setting where young players disappear. Victor responded with 30 points, 15 rebounds, and 5 blocks in a single postseason game. No player that young had ever done that in playoff history. The names he pushed past weren't just any names: Akeem Olajuwon and Wilt Chamberlain. Let that sit for a second. A 22-year-old in only his second playoff series is now in territory that those two never reached at the same age. That's not a comp you throw around casually. That's the kind of historical moment people look back on years later and realize they were watching something genuinely rare unfold in real time. The Western Conference Finals arrival only made things louder. 41 points and 24 rebounds on the biggest stage in the Western Conference, and he looked completely locked in from the opening tip. That performance put him in a club of all-time greats who had ever posted a 40 and 20 in a conference finals game. Victor wasn't knocking on the door of greatness, he was already inside. But then something slightly different happened in Games 2 and 3. He was still productive, still impactful, still making winning plays. The issue wasn't that he played badly, the issue was that Game 1 had set an expectation that was almost impossible to maintain, and the non-stop attack mentality that made Game 1 so overwhelming wasn't always present across every single possession. Shaquille O'Neal, one of the few people on the planet who actually has standing to critique a dominant big man, noticed it publicly. And honestly, Shaq wasn't wrong. Game 1 was a complete takeover from the opening tip, constant aggression, imposing his will on every possession, making OKC's entire defense look like it had no real answer. Games 2 and 3 had the same talent on display, but not always the same relentless intensity. For a player who's already capable of doing what Victor does, that's the one thing that separates good playoff runs from legendary ones: the ability to stay in attack mode even when the game isn't demanding it from you. The Spurs didn't just need Victor to be good, they needed him to be a problem on every single possession, every single night. So, heading into Game 4 with the series tied at 2, the whole conversation around the league had quietly shifted. People weren't asking if Victor was talented enough anymore. Everyone already knew the answer to that. The question was about mentality. Could he hear the noise, process the criticism, and come out even sharper? And from the absolute first minute of Game 4, he answered that question before most people had even settled into their seats. 3 shot attempts in the first 90 seconds. No hesitation, no easing into it, no waiting for the game to come to him. He made the decision before tip-off that this game was his, and everything that followed was just the execution of that decision playing out in real time.
The first quarter told you everything you needed to know about what kind of night it was going to be. 11 points, 3 assists, 2 blocks, and a plus 11 in the first 12 minutes alone. Every time Victor touched the ball, the energy in San Antonio shifted noticeably. OKC's defense was scrambling before the play even developed because they knew what was coming, and knowing didn't actually help them stop it. When he started connecting on deep threes early in the quarter, the crowd didn't just react, they lost themselves in the moment. The building had an electricity to it that you can't manufacture. That's what a player does when he's locked in at the highest possible level. He doesn't just make plays, he changes the emotional temperature of an entire arena. By halftime, Victor had 22 points, 4 rebounds, 3 assists, and a plus 16 for the half. Statistically impressive, sure, but the real story wasn't the counting stats, it was the consistency. Unlike Game 3, where San Antonio jumped out to a huge early lead and then let it slip away completely, this time the pressure never let up. There was no second quarter collapse, no defensive breakdowns that let OKC claw their way back in. Victor was setting the pace, and the Spurs were following his lead, and for the first time in this series, OKC genuinely looked like they had no real answer for what was happening to them. Then came the moment that essentially ended the game emotionally before the third quarter even started. Right before halftime, Victor launched a 40-foot buzzer beater that went straight through the net and turned the entire building into pure chaos. His teammates unglued, the bench erupted. Even the people watching from a distance had to stop and process what they'd just seen. That shot pushed the lead to 12 and did something to OKC's spirit that no timeout or halftime adjustment was going to fix. Some moments in playoff basketball don't just change the score, they change what both teams believe is possible. That buzzer beater was one of those moments, and everybody in that building felt it simultaneously. The second half was almost procedural after that. San Antonio closed the door in the third, and by the fourth, the game had turned into exactly the kind of controlled, comfortable blowout that the first half had promised. But the real number that tells the full story of what Victor is doing in this series isn't any single game stat, it's the overall series line. 30.3 points per game, 13.3 rebounds, 4.3 assists, 3 blocks, while shooting 53% from the field, 43% from 3, and 88% from the free throw line. As a 7'5" human being, those are numbers that don't exist in the real world. They sound like someone typed into a video game to see what would happen. What makes this even more absurd is the supporting cast around him. Not a single Spurs teammate is averaging over 18 points per game in this series. Nobody else in the rotation is shooting above 50% from the field. In basically every other series in playoff history with this kind of offensive production from one player, that player is getting help from at least 1 or 2 genuinely dangerous offensive options. Victor isn't. He's carrying this team almost entirely on his own, and somehow that team is still right in the middle of a Western Conference Finals series with the path to the finals completely open in front of them. The gap between what he contributes and what everyone else contributes isn't just noticeable, it's historically wide. But here's the part that doesn't get enough attention when people talk about Victor's impact in this series. His most important work might not even be on offense. The effect he's had on Shai Gilgeous-Alexander defensively is something that deserves its own conversation entirely. STA came into this series as one of the 3 or 4 most unguardable players on the planet. His mid-range game, that smooth, effortless, hyper-efficient scoring style, is the kind of offensive skill set that dismantles every conventional defensive scheme you can throw at it. Against Victor, that efficiency collapsed. SGA is shooting 39.2% from the field this series, the lowest percentage of his entire playoff career. His mid-range percentage has dropped nearly 20 complete points compared to the regular season. Victor doesn't just block shots, he makes elite offensive players doubt themselves before the shot even leaves their hand, and that's a much rarer and more valuable defensive skill. The conversation around Victor right now has an urgency to it that feels different from the usual young superstar hype cycle. Usually, when a player this young has a big playoff run, people pump the brakes and say, wait until he does it multiple times, wait until he faces even better competition, wait until the league figures him out. With Victor, nobody seems willing to pump the brakes. The people who study this game the most carefully, the ones who are hardest to impress, are the same ones saying out loud that he might already be the best player alive. Not the most talented, not the best prospect, the best player right now at 22. That shift in how he's being talked about, from generational prospect to current best player, is genuinely the most significant version of that conversation since LeBron James made it happen in real time during his early Cleveland years. Now, with the series tied at 4 and the Spurs fully capable of reaching the NBA Finals, the question everyone keeps circling back to is a simple one. What does this mean if he actually gets there? A 22-year-old superstar carrying a young and inexperienced roster reaching the Finals in his very first deep playoff run would be a storyline the NBA hasn't had in decades. And if he wins, if he actually wins, the entire conversation about who the face of this league is stops being a debate. It becomes a statement of fact. Victor already plays with the kind of fearlessness and competitive hunger that doesn't need to be developed over